Do we need more coffee, a little more caffeine? Get the blood flowing? Well, let's talk about the super circular itself. One of the things that I've observed is that O&B was very good at patting itself on the back for doing a great job in developing uniform guidance that consolidated all this stuff. And O&B, if you read some of the initial literature and press releases associated with the December 26th, 2014 Federal Register publication, is O&B will say we really didn't do anything new. We just basically cut and pasted and did a lot of editing work. We created no new requirements. We just re-emphasized, underscored, put new emphasis on stuff that was always there. For those of us on the other side of the table who receive grants or manage grants, the fact of the matter is, this is the most significant change in the grants management landscape since 1979. There are a lot of big changes with the super circular. Lots of big changes. Impacts all executive branch departments of the federal government. I mentioned, I don't know how many are, you probably know more than I do. There's probably 14, 16 executive branch departments. There are 39,000 of you out there who get federal grant money, and the 39,000 entities receive something in the neighborhood of $500 billion per year. So we're kind of talking real money here. So this is a very impactful bit of regulation. A couple of you, the scourge of my existence, Medicaid. I know there's somebody from HHS in here. I won't talk ill of Medicaid. Some programs were exempted from coverage of the super circular. And those that were near and dear to my heart, TANF, temporary assistance to needy families, and Medicaid are not subject to the super circular. They play by their own rules. And if you thought FTA rules were complex, they don't scratch the surface of Medicaid rules, let me tell you. They do apply to FTA grants, all FTA grants. So if you get bus capital under 5339, E&D assistance under 5310, rural formula assistance under 5311, urban formula assistance under 5307, planning monies under 5303, the super circular applies to all of it. A couple of things that I think the super circular did that was really necessary. It clarified the organizational relationships and compliance status when money passes from one entity to the other. And from what I can tell, some initial conversations with Nancy and Michelle, is that some of your relationships are like a spider web. There's all kinds of paths, nooks, and crannies where the money flows. And that's relatively important because we now have a fairly well-defined structure in terms of what applies to whom. So we have recipients, subrecipients, and lower tier subrecipients. And we have this notion of a pass-through, which is a different concept than a contract or a contractor. And there's a difference between a contractor and a subrecipient. And so one of the questions that I have to ask myself when I get posed some of the questions by GDOT is, are they talking about a contractor or a lower tier subrecipient? Because that will make an important distinction in the answers and technical assistance that's provided to you folks. And I will say, I think the super circular has done a good job in this. And Georgia's not the only state where we have these complex relationships. You go in Oregon and I may spend half a compliance review just trying to figure out the organization chart. And their monies, they have all kinds of subcontracting relationships. So it's not unusual.
Rich, what is a lower tier subrecipient, just for clarification?
Yeah, there are some states, for example, like Ohio and Indiana, where a state agency cannot enter into a contract with a nonprofit organization. So if the nonprofit is the logical choice to operate rural public transit services in a community, by law, Indiana DOT and Ohio DOT have to contract with the county or a municipality that would stand in the shoes of a county. And then the county or the city, in turn, would sign a contract and give all the money to that nonprofit to operate the service. The state is the primary recipient, the county would be the subrecipient, and the nonprofit organization would be the lower tier subrecipient. In some cases in Oregon, we have monies flowing from the state to a designated transit district that may serve a multi-county area. The transit district would in turn enter into a lower tier subcontract with a regional planning organization who then in turn gives the money to a nonprofit to actually deliver services. We go down 4 levels. So we have primary subrecipients, lower tier subrecipients, and lower tier subrecipients. It gets very complex. But we have to understand whether the money is flowing via the mechanism of the pass-through relationship or whether it's flowing as a contractor relationship. And normally a competitive process is the determining factor as to whether or not you're a pass-through subrecipient or whether you are a contractor. The Association of Governmental Accountants has developed sort of a decision tree that poses 5 central questions, and you answer yes or no, and depending on the yes-no answers to those questions, it will help determine whether or not you're a subcontractor or whether you are a lower tier subrecipient or whether you're a contractor. Very useful bit of guidance. The other thing that is noteworthy, that FTA attorneys will not concede this point, I must add. But OMB says if there's anything in existing guidance that is contrary to what's in the super circular prevails. And for those of us in rural transit, particularly those of us who get 5311 or 5310 assistance, does anyone know our primary regulatory guidance where we would find that? 9041G would be 5311, and what is it for 5310? Anybody know? 9070. Those circulars predate the super circular. So there's lots of areas in those circulars that are out of date that FTA will acknowledge are out of date. And in the same breath tell you OMB does not trump FTA, while OMB will sit at the next table and say, yes, we do. And so this could be very confusing for some folks. I'm in the school of thought, and I don't tell this if Mary Ann or Stock, who runs the community transit programs in DC, is in the room. I don't see her, so I think I'm safe. I'm on OMB side here. Now there are things that may congressionally be included in these circulars that will trump OMB, but generally if it's just administrative rule articulated 9040 or 9070, OMB will trump that guidance. So it becomes a very tricky point if you have a complex compliance question as to what the applicable rules are right now. FTA normally updates its circulars within 2 years after passage of a reauthorization act. And we had a reauthorization act, and I don't remember the effective date, but I believe it was in 2015. And you may have heard of the FAST Act. That's our latest reauthorization bill. That's what gives FTA the authority to operate a 5310 and a 5311 program and all of its programs. Unfortunately, it's been, almost 3 full years after passage of that act, and we don't have an update to 9041G. There is no 9041H, which would be in sync with the super circular. I'm told it's coming, but I've heard that message for 2 years, and it hasn't happened yet. So, if you're in doubt, you've got your own compliance or questions at the local level, and your GDOT representative tells you, look at 9040 or look at 9070, take that advice with a little bit of grain of salt and consult with a super circular expert to make sure that you're not doing the wrong thing. GDOT staff should be up to date on some of this stuff, so hopefully they're giving you great advice right out of the box. One of the things that we were trying to do, excuse me, in the reform of existing OMB guidance was to create more transparency at the federal level and what they were doing with your money. I don't know, I've noticed it, but you may have noticed, we tend to be very polarized these days with respect to our politics, and just let one side of the aisle do something a little bit off kilter, and the opposing side will jump all fours and make hay of the situation. We don't really want that to happen. Anybody here from Wisconsin? I think he was from Wisconsin. There was a senator by the name, old crudgy guy, old curmudgeon, William Proxmire. And every month he held a news conference because he gave out an award. And he did this with pomp and ceremony like it was the Oscars. And he called it the Golden Fleece Award. And he would have his staff each month go through grant awards that his federal agency would make. And he'd pick out something particularly ridiculous. You know, we just awarded a grant to some university for $200 million to investigate the, mating habits of some flea or something like this. And he would get up and talk about it being a waste of the taxpayer dollars. And he was a Republican, I think, and he was always giving the Democrats a hard time. And no one wants that to happen. So what we were trying to do is create more transparency. How many of you were around during the economic stimulus and received FTA money under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARA? Remember, we had to do certain special things to get that money. Had to have a DUNS number. We had to do additional paperwork. Some of those procedures were designed to create transparency because ARA was under the political microscope. Those procedures have been applied to the entire grants management landscape. So one side of the aisle or the other can always learn what the federal agencies are up to in terms of how they're spending your tax dollars. And I think that's a good thing, more transparency. The only time OMB does not trump existing language is if it's mandated by Congress that we do something otherwise. And we do have some things in transit that basically violate Grants Management 101. We in transit have congressional authority to use federal monies to match other federal monies. Most other grant recipients do not have that authority. We do. We'll talk about it before we close out this day. So we mentioned effective dates a little bit earlier. Just a reminder, if your grant contract with the state DOT is executed after December 26th, you comply with the super circular in terms of how you get audited, how the oversight agencies measure compliance. Again, the FTA guidance can be found in 2 CFR Part 1201. Like all things federal legalese, the super circular has a somewhat complex organization structure. It's divided into subparts. A is acronyms and definitions. And if you're an organization that receives federal grant awards from different organizations, and if you've been around as a grant, somebody raised their hand said they were a grants manager. Who was that? How long have you been a grants manager?
With GDOT a year, but I've been in transit about 18 years.
So most of your familiarity then will be with US DOT grants. Anybody wear the title of grants manager in your respective organizations at the local level? Guys just aren't cooperating today. If you were, you would realize that one of the frustrating elements of managing the grants of multiple federal agencies is that you would think they'd all speak the same language. But even, to use a transit example that's frequently used, sometimes even how we count trips or units of service is different in transit than it is under the Older Americans Act. And it would be nice as the grants manager if all those federal folks up in DC or in Atlanta played by the same rule book. And that's one of the things that subpart A was attempting to do, provide uniform definitions. Another frustrating fact, if you were responsible for managing your organization's asset inventory, if you got capital from DOT, anything $5,000 or higher had to go on the asset inventory. But if you got capital funds from another federal agency, they might have a different level. So you might have stuff that you paid $2,000 for have to go on your asset inventory because of HUD, but over here you had to figure out, this is DOT, it's $5,000. Very complex. OMB wiped that out and said everybody will play by the same capitalization level. It is now a uniform standard, no matter where the federal money came from. If it was $5,000 or over, it's now considered a capital asset. It becomes part of your inventory. In particular, the nonprofit sector complained bitterly that if they just bought a computer for $1,400, some federal agencies required you to capitalize these computers that sometimes had a useful life less than 2 years. And that was a lot of trouble, a lot of administrivia. And so this was aimed at reducing the level of administrative burden that was imposed on your shoulders as a result of one federal agency not playing by the same rules that another federal agency followed. And so we sort of made some progress in that regard. General provisions primarily relate to those executive branch departments. Pre-award requirements also primarily relate to those federal branch departments. We won't talk much about that. The stuff that's important to you begins in subpart D. So if you're the kind of person who had a book report in high school, and the first thing you did was run down to Barnes & Noble, buy the Cliff Notes, and you still practice that philosophy, when you download the Maximus version of the Super Circular, just go straight to Part D. Part E are the cost principles. Tear that section out, give it to your finance department. That's indirect costs and what you can and cannot charge to a federal grant. Every single employee in your finance department ought to know this stuff if you administer federal grant funds. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is that the people who come to sessions like this aren't the people that when an invoice comes in, writes down the code from our chart of accounts to tell the accounting clerk, one, what bucket to drop this expense into. The people who do that coding don't get to come to conferences. Yet they're the ones who make critical decisions as to whether or not we're going to charge this expense to a federal grant award. They're the ones who need to know this. So I'm going to challenge the folks in this room that when you go back to your respective organizations, make sure you do an assessment. Who needs to know this? And it's kind of the folks at the bottom tier of the organization chart. It's the accounting clerk one, maybe not necessarily the CFO, that needs to know some of the intricate details of what's in the cost principles of subpart E. And in terms of the audit requirements, that's really in the domain of your CFO, of your organization. And just to add additional confusion, because it is, after all, coming from Washington, D.C., there are 11 appendices to the super circular. The two most important appendices for the folks in this room are 4 and 7. How many of you are nonprofits? Do you claim indirect costs under your federal grant awards? The rules and regulations for doing so are in an appendix. If you're a public agency, you're in another appendix. I believe 4 is the appendix that relates to state and local governments, and 7, or I might have that backwards, relates to nonprofits. But the rules for determining indirect cost and how to prepare indirect cost allocation plans are in the appendices. And they're the two most important ones for our discussions here this morning. All right, I was asked a little earlier to highlight one of what clearly was one of the major changes in the super circular, and that was the raising of the audit threshold for single audit from $500,000 to $750,000. And if your fiscal year began on or after December 26, 2014, you were subject to the new $750,000 audit threshold. That got a lot of headlines. And quite frankly, in the rural transit community, that 500 to 750K level is kind of a sweet spot for a lot of 5311 recipients. I've gotten a lot of feedback from state program managers saying, what do? We really relied on those single audits for us to tell whether or not our subrecipients were playing by the rules. And now O&B is telling us we're not allowed to audit those agencies. That's not quite true, but I think it did take an awful lot of 5311 recipients out from under the requirement to prepare a single audit. O&B estimates 5,000 of those 39 total federal grant recipients fell out of the requirement with this new threshold. And as you'll see in a subsequent slide, O&B further says, even though that may sound like a high number that we're letting a lot of people go, we're not keeping a close watch. O&B counters by saying, even though we now only have 34,000 people we're going to audit, we're still auditing 99% of the $500 billion. So we've ease the administrative cost of preparing financial statements and audits on our grantees, yet we're still protecting the taxpayer's interest by auditing 99% of those grant awards under our single audit concept. And that's logic that's hard to argue against. You got a question?
Rich, so can you explain about the cognizant agency and who you would send those reports to, and that's based on federal? And then you mentioned earlier the period of the audit should coincide with the grantor.
Right, and you're getting a little bit ahead of me, because I will deal with this strange word that for some reason Bill Gates will always trigger spell check when you type it in a document, and that's the concept of a cognizant federal agency. We'll talk a little bit about it right now. One of the frustrating factors for many nonprofit organizations, there's a relatively regimented procedure for how to claim indirect costs under your federal grant awards. Those procedures have not changed much. But what has happened is with the issuance of the super circular, the responsibilities of the federal government for carrying out their part of the bargain, as we put a spotlight on it. And in the past, nonprofits in particular complained. We went to the trouble to prepare an indirect cost rate proposal. We submitted it to our cognizant federal agency, and we did that 2 years ago, and we haven't heard one word from the agency ever since. This is the proverbial hot potato. No one wanted to deal with processing indirect cost allocation rate proposals. By focusing on the role of the cognizant agency, I think every executive branch agency in DC has now created indirect cost units to handle and process these things, and it's going to flow much better. Plus, there's clear articulation of the relationship of a pass-through entity, such as a state DOT, in reviewing, negotiating, and approving indirect cost rate proposals. That should be either a blessing or a curse, depending on what state you live in, with respect to indirect cost. It was clear that one of the goals in issuing the super circular was to make it easier for you guys to get paid indirect costs under your federal grant awards. There's a number of initiatives in the super circular, and we'll cover them all, including the next bullet, that makes it easier for you to get indirect cost. Outside of the audit threshold changing, the single biggest change, I think, in the super circular was the establishment of a new indirect cost rate that has a very, very funny name. And only lawyers use this term. Historically, it's only had legal connotation. It's something known as the de minimis rate. In essence, it is an automatic 10% indirect cost rate, and you don't have to do nothing to get it. And if you read the websites of CPA firms that go after your business, they will all say, we're experts at the de minimis rate, we can help you get this. We know all about this. This is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And they are partially correct. But there are some, like all things federal, I think there's some cautions that we need to be aware of before we jump on the de minimis bandwagon. We'll talk about those this afternoon. Now, how many, again, I asked this earlier, are subject to A133 audits, single audits? All right, have any of you ever read one of your prior audits? Usually the board of directors does that, or some, our county commissions and the like. Does anybody remember language of an audit finding that cited us for lack of internal control because we had insufficient segregation of duties. You're shaking your head, so I'll pick on you. What did the auditors pick on you for?
Well, we don't have that problem, but in my previous life,
Yeah, my brother wants to know about those little blue bills, right?
small cities usually they don't have enough people to have one person doing like cash management, another person reviewing cash management, and another person supervising. So you've got one person doing all of money.
Yeah, one of the things, that's a pretty good description. Auditors like to see segregation of duties so that one person isn't tasked with too much responsibility so that he or she can get into some funny business, like and make my wall of shame. One of the things that the Super Circular has done, and we usually, when did we learn about we lacked sufficient segregation of duties? When we read about it in our annual audit report. We relied on the auditors to determine when our organization, job responsibilities, job descriptions were insufficient. The Super Circular shifts that burden from the audit firm to you. It's your responsibility. We'll talk about that a little later on. Anybody ever go to a county fair and see on the midway a game called whack-a-mole? Sure, you beat one down and two more pop up and you never get ahead. What OMB was observing is that bad actors would rip off the federal government, would get debarred, and then would get shut down. The very next day they popped up with a new articles of incorporation, and instead of being the Acme widget company, they were the Delta widget company, and they were back bidding on federal contracts. And this primarily related to construction, federally financed construction work in the New York City area, but a problem nationwide. Some of which you can read about on my wall of shame, because some of those people were debarred and they're back in the transit industry. What we want to do is we don't want you to do business with bad actors. So if someone's ever been debarred, we want to make sure you don't expend federal funds doing business with that company. And so we now have more stringent, regulated conflict of interest statements that have to be submitted with your grant applications. In the industry, we call them COIs. And if you misrepresent something on your COI, we now have some pretty stark penalties. Your organization will be debarred. And that means you'll be ineligible for federal financial assistance from any source. That would be a fairly catastrophic outcome for any transit agency and most nonprofits and municipal governments, county, regional, or local. So take this new COI stipulation very seriously. If you read the OMB press releases, they will talk about emphasis on grant performance over the nitpicking details of compliance. And if you've ever been subject to a triennial review or a state management review from FTA, a drug and alcohol review from FTA, you'll know that FTA is one compliance-centric organization. I doubt whether this focus on performance over compliance is going to have much impact on FTA, primarily because they're such a small organization. They just cannot exercise adequate oversight without running all these different compliance oversight processes. Anybody have any idea how many people would you guess work for FTA? right, 350 from someone who might know. Anybody else want to hazard a guess?
425.
425. 150.
They contract a lot of stuff out.
I got that public transit at GDOT. She wishes. Usually people guess 4,000, 2,000.
No.
It's about, right now, I think it's between 450 and 500. FDA, relatively speaking, for doing $12 billion a year in business, relatively small organization. So when you read press releases or your auditors tell you there's a decrease in focus on compliance, don't believe it with respect to your FTA grants. That's not meant as an insult to FTA. I'll let you know when I'm giving you a dig on FTA. I'll be pretty blunt about it. Standardization of application and award data. Some of the things that we had to do to qualify for stimulus money, ARA money, is now standard operating procedure on all of our grants. So you'll see more numbers that we'll have to know that are on the faceplate of any contract that we get from GDOT, that have to be on the faceplates of any contracts that we enter into with lower tier entities, because we are obligated to provide all that information to them. In my personal opinion, OMB will say, because we did all this consolidation, we're such great folks, that we made grant administrative practices easier for you at the local level. In some ways, I don't believe that statement. It takes me longer to find an answer to a grant question under the super circular than it did with the old school. Because now if I want to know an issue about the allowability of an advisory council at a nonprofit 5311 system, I've got to go to selected items of cost and I've got to read the whole piece. Whereas before I could just go to A87 and find the right answer, or A122 and find the answer. Because what the super circular will periodically do is, in reality, they didn't consolidate the same guidance and apply the same rules. Universities, public agencies, and nonprofits, in some cases, particularly with personnel, for example, we have a set of rules. And then we have separate rules for universities. And then we have separate rules again for nonprofits. And you got to read the whole thing and you're going to miss something if you had just read the first paragraph. And that, because of that, I find it sometimes more time consuming to get the correct answer out of the super circular than it used to take me when I could deal with one of the previous guidance.